Okay, so this video was supposed to be about my 2021 goals, and I guess that's just gonna have to wait until 2021 now. So for those of you who don't know, for both the April Camp NaNoWriMo and the July Camp NaNoWriMo, I wrote Star Wars fanfiction, and honestly, I would say I'm somewhat of an expert on Star Wars. However, I will say the bar to being like an expert in Star Wars is a lot higher than it is in most fandoms, because not only do you have the main 9 live-action movies, you have heaps and heaps of cartoons and video games and expanded universe novels and canon novels and what even is expanded universe versus the new Disney canon. But in my immediate friend group, I would say I am the Star Wars expert of the group. And both recently and in the past several years, a lot of my friends who were like kind of casually into Star Wars, but not like super in it the way I am, have been coming up to me and asking me like, hey, what is going on with the Star Wars fandom? So this is a summarization of kind of the different sects of the Star Wars fandom. So this is not going to be like a breakdown of any one specific drama. This is going to be a broad, beginner-friendly breakdown of the Star Wars fandom on the internet as it stands right now. And to start off, I will say, I think the Star Wars fandom is probably the most diverse fandom I have ever seen anywhere. I think a lot of people have a preconceived notion of a Star Wars fan as like kind of like a older male, maybe on the geekier side. But people within the Star Wars fandom are like all over the place. For example, just in my personal life, my director who directed the show that I assistant stage managed last year, she's like fashionista, like she has a fashion Instagram that's all about upcycling and thrifting clothes, but she's also super into Star Wars. But I think what divides Star Wars fans, even though we basically like the same property, is that what divides us is which trilogy we like. And that is heavily dependent on which trilogy we were introduced to, or we were at a certain age when that trilogy was being released. Like, I was almost nearly part of like the prequel crowd. I was about 6 years old when Revenge of the Sith came out, but my dad, who was also a very big fan of Star Wars, saw Revenge of the Sith first without me because he was like, oh, I want to take Kim to see a Star Wars movie, because at the time we thought that was going to be the last one. And he saw it and was like, ooh, okay, this might be too violent for a 6-year-old. But that was just my parents, because I do know of a lot of people my age who saw Revenge of the Sith in theaters and are like, therefore, like people who really love the prequels. And in terms of trilogies, I am mainly going to be talking about prequel people versus sequel people. Obviously, there are fans who have been watching since Star Wars or A New Hope now. My father is one of them. He saw the original Star Wars in 1977. But fans who are really hardcore into the original trilogy are not as active on the internet in this nearly the same number and with nearly the same fervor as the prequel people and the sequel people. Actually, I would say that people who are really into the original trilogy tend to skew to be like kind of older creators. I do want to make a correction from earlier. I said that like people who are really into the original trilogy aren't as active on the internet, but then I remembered all the Empire Strikes Back people. Not even just like people who saw Empire Strikes Back in theaters. I think from what it sounds like, either Empire Strikes Back was rerun on TV a lot through the 80s and 90s, or it was very frequently distributed either on like VHS or at like Blockbuster or something. Because keep in mind, after Return of the Jedi, there was a huge chunk of time between the final movie of the original trilogy coming out and then the first prequel coming out. But you still hear about like fans from throughout the 90s who are particularly this category of people I'm talking about, people who are really into Empire Strikes Back, almost to like the detriment of the other 2 movies of the original trilogy. Empire Strikes Back is like the movie of the original trilogy I hear talked about the most within this particular subsection of the fandom. Not to mention, people liking the original trilogy, it tends to be one of the very, very few points of consensus that the larger Star Wars fan base has. And by very rare points of consensus, I mean a very, very rare, because one thing you will notice as I get further into this video is that Star Wars fans cannot agree on anything. Speaking of never being able to agree on anything, let's get back to prequel trilogy versus sequel trilogy. So kind of my running theory is that a lot of people like me who kind of just missed the prequels ended up getting into the sequel trilogy later on as like older teenagers. Because with prequel fans, what you hear a lot of is, oh, I was like really young when I went to see the prequels and it was like a pivotal moment of my childhood. Whereas a lot of fans of the sequels are kind of like teenage age, maybe around more like my age. Especially on the female side, I think the sequel fan base skews older compared to the prequel fan base in terms of the median age we were originally introduced to Star Wars. Now, while the sequel trilogy was the first trilogy I actually saw in theaters, my actual introduction to Star Wars was through the Clone Wars cartoon series that originally aired on Cartoon Network. And while now the cartoon series is sort of lauded as this like great work of fiction, it wasn't always like this. This is what I mean, like Star Wars fans don't agree on anything. I remember being on the internet like when the cartoon was first coming out and people like complaining that, oh, this is too childish for Star Wars, like they should be focusing on making more live action movies, this is a waste of time. And now, similar to the prequels, the people who have kind of grown up with the cartoons have kind of gotten older and are now like championing the cartoon. And for a while, it was almost like a cycle of properties that were not the original trilogy. It was like the prequels, when they came out, were like universally panned. You, of course, have the famous Plinkett reviews of the prequels, in which Mike Stoklasa, as the character Plinkett, goes minute by minute through all three prequels, pointing out every little thing, and even larger than Star Wars, I think the Plinkett reviews sort of revolutionized fandom commentary and movie commentary, particularly within Star Wars itself. But even with the Plinkett reviews being so well known within the fandom, the people who loved the prequels as children grew up and wanted to espouse their love for the prequels in a bigger way. It started with memes. It started with, hello there, General Kenobi, I have the high ground. And especially as the sequel trilogy came out and there kind of became kind of a new kid to pick on, basically, people who love the prequels, who were relegated before to a more kind of ironic love through memes, were able to kind of rise up and show their love in a more genuine way. I say love, like this is some kind of great romance. And same thing with the cartoons. People were very critical at first. Maybe less so in a way because, you know, cartoons don't really get the same reach that a live action movie does. But it's sort of the same cycle where people are critical at first, and then the people who grow up with it grow up and are suddenly like, hey, look at this great thing. But the cycle, I think, is different for the sequel trilogy. Because like I said, the kind of medium age of people who started getting into the sequel trilogy and saw the sequel trilogy in theaters is older. So there's not this time period of people are critical, but the people who love it grow up. And then they come back and being like, hey, look at this great thing. And I think that's why we get the most division between the people who love the sequel trilogy and the people who love the prequel trilogy, and honestly even some of the people who love the original trilogy, is because while people are still very critical of kind of the newest thing, there are also people who are already old enough to like be on the internet and are able to say, or rather have the resources to say, I love this thing and I really want to talk about why I love this thing. Also, now compared to when the prequel trilogy was coming out, we have not only more access to the internet, but people are getting access to the internet at a younger age. Like in the 2000s, when the prequels were coming out, to have internet, you needed a computer, and most fandom content was written content. Video was there. Like I said, there were the Plinkett reviews, and there were a few other kind of video-oriented Star Wars-y things, but most fandom content at the time was still written, so you not only needed a computer, you needed a higher level of reading comprehension and patience to like read through these Star Wars articles or Star Wars websites. Whereas now there's so much more video content in fandom, and it is so much easier to digest and access. And honestly, when I talk about age difference, I'm not really talking about a huge age difference. Like the prequels, from what I can tell, it's mostly like young kids. Like I said, I was like 6 years old when Revenge of the Sith came out. That's kind of the age I generally think of when I think of like when people got into the prequels. But when I think of like people who got into the sequels, I'm thinking like teenagers. And now we're getting into the sequel trilogy, and I think part of the reason why there's so much dissonance between sequel trilogy people and kind of the like other part of Star Wars fandom is because people who like the sequel trilogy do not tend to occupy the same spaces as regular Star Wars fandom. The places I see the most love for the sequel trilogy are on Tumblr and Instagram, and both Tumblr and Instagram are very good at sectioning people off into kind of only places where they want to be, where they're going to hear opinions similar to theirs. On Instagram, particularly because it is a more widely used platform compared to Tumblr, sometimes on like big Star Wars pages, you'll see some animosity, but generally speaking, people tend to stay in their own camps. You will also notice that Tumblr and Instagram are both more female-oriented social media networks, and that gets into my other part of the sequel trilogy, is I feel like more than the other two trilogies, the sequel trilogy, in terms of fans, tends to skew female. I think the female fandom in Star Wars in general tends to get underestimated, but especially in the sequel trilogy. Because similar to the dilemma of sequel trilogy versus like other people, female fandom does not tend to occupy the same spaces as male fandom, and that is a huge sweeping generalization that excludes the queer part of the fandom, the non-binary part of the fandom, and honestly also excludes me. I'm really burning all of my bridges right now because you have one part of the fandom, particularly fans of the original trilogy and the prequels, who believe that sort of modern social justice elements should not be involved in Star Wars whatsoever. But then you also have the younger, cis-hetero female audience who tends to like the sequel trilogy. And I'm also gonna piss them off by saying, honestly, I have never found Kylo Ren attractive. And I do think Kylo Ren is a big point of appeal for a large part of the sequel trilogy fandom. And while all the trilogies all have their different strengths to them, I think it's easier for a certain subsection of the fandom to not be able to see the appeal of the sequel trilogy, because the sequel trilogy is just liked in a very different way compared to the other two. Like, both the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy kind of have that commonality of a lot of really interesting planets and also a lot of memeable lines. Like, we quote kind of the young Ian McGregor version of Obi-Wan's, like, his hello there, but when really hello there came from the original Star Wars movie. And I think particularly a lot of male fans underestimate the romance between Rey and Kylo Ren as being a strength of the sequel trilogy. I do know that even within like the sequel trilogy fandom, there is issues with the Rey and Kylo Ren romance. It is incredibly problematic. But even though the sequel trilogy has its strength in the romance, it doesn't share the same commonality between the other two trilogies, having a lot of memorable settings or a lot of kind of quotable dialogue. And we can go on and on about the plot issues in the sequel I would honestly argue that no Star Wars trilogy has a perfect plot. Star Wars fans really like to harp on and on about their plot. I remember during the prequel trilogy, there was this thing going around the internet called the Ring Theory, which tried to make poetic plot parallels between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, and everybody likes to quote that famous George Lucas line, it's like poetry, it rhymes. But people can enjoy a trilogy for reasons other than plot. And I hate to say this, but like one of the reasons it's so easy to pick on the sequel trilogy compared to the other two is because it's enjoyed in the way that Twilight is enjoyed. It is enjoyed in the way that like Draco Malfoy fans enjoyed the Harry Potter series. And while there are these types of fans in every trilogy, like there were people speculating about whether Leia would end up with Luke or Han, of course before we knew that Luke is Leia's brother. And of course there are still fan accounts dedicated to Anakin and Hayden Christensen, but there really wasn't any mystery in that romance in the same that there was in the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy about who was going to end up with who. And a good plot is not a necessity for fans to enjoy content in that way. Like when I read romantic Star Wars fan fiction, one of the things I commonly notice with fan fiction writers is that they really don't pay attention to the plot of whatever trilogy they're writing about, be it the sequel trilogy, the prequel trilogy, even the original trilogy. There are so many different reasons to enjoy a piece of media. There's so many different aspects in which you can enjoy a piece of media. There's so many ways to show your appreciation for a piece of media, and I think Star Wars just has so much to offer that it attracts so many different kinds of people who enjoy their fandom in very different ways. And before I close this out, there's kind of a part of Star Wars fandom that I've been kind of putting off acknowledging, but even if you're like me and you think that the majority of Star Wars fans are not toxic or problematic, you have to acknowledge that that element does exist. There are horrible people in every fandom, but because, like I've been saying, Star Wars has such a diverse fandom, I think while it brings in some of the best, it also brings in some of the worst. And I generally think we all know who I'm talking about when I say this. I'm talking about like the people who drove Kelly Marie Tran off of Instagram, the people who are a little too enthusiastic about their Imperial officer cosplay, the people who get a little too edgy in Darkside SWOTOR chat. I think like in any fandom, there needs to be some accountability and some self-policing of some of the ugliest elements of the Star Wars fandom.
Hello, Editing Kim here. So I realized I did not talk about The Mandalorian at all, which makes literally no sense because The Mandalorian is obviously the most recent Star Wars thing to have come out. But I think that's also kind of the problem in that it takes a while before we truly understand how much a property has an effect on the fandom at large. I think that both The Mandalorian show and then also Rise of Skywalker are still sitting in that grace period of we really don't know how this is going to affect the fandom because we haven't had enough time to process it. I think lockdown has also affected that as well because I honestly haven't heard enough just from like talking to regular people and not just kind of Star Wars fanatics like me about kind of the most recent things because we've all been locked down. We really haven't been able to see each other. Actually, funny enough, Rise of Skywalker was actually the last movie I saw in theaters before everything happened. So yeah, I know the instinct is kind of to commentate on something in the moment right after it's happened, but I just don't have enough information on how it's affected the fandom and how kind of the different factions of the Star Wars fandom really feel about these things yet. So that's all I have to say. Back to when I was still wearing makeup.
But the sun is starting to set now, although now you can really tell that my makeup today is supposed to be like Dark Side Night Sister inspired. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next week in 2021.